locked door. That's all it took for everything to change. What started as a promising date became a nightmare of drugging, captivity, and violation. This is the story of someone who trusted too easily, missed the warning signs too readily, and paid a devastating price for wanting connection. But it's also a story about survival, about rescue arriving just in time, and about the long, difficult journey of recovery after trauma shatters your sense of safety. This psychological thriller explores how predators exploit dating apps and human loneliness, the warning signs that seem obvious only in retrospect, and what happens when trust becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. Subscribe to Should Have Known Stories for more tales that will make you reconsider the risks hiding in everyday choices. Watch the next video to hear another story about warnings missed and lessons learned too late. I should have known when she locked the door behind me, but I didn't. I should have known when she locked the door behind me, but I didn't. The sound barely registered, just a soft metallic click as I stepped into her apartment, too distracted by the warm lighting and the faint scent of jasmine candles to process what it meant. She smiled as she turned from the door, and that smile was everything I'd been hoping for since we matched online 3 weeks ago. Our conversations had been electric, filled with shared interests and late-night messages that made me feel understood in a way I hadn't experienced in years. When she suggested meeting at her place for dinner instead of a crowded restaurant, I'd felt honored. Chosen, like she trusted me enough to skip the usual dating formalities. Her apartment looked exactly like someone curated and intentional would live. Exposed brick walls, vintage furniture that looked expensive but not pretentious, bookshelves filled with titles I recognized and wanted to discuss. A small dining table was set for two, with actual cloth napkins and wine glasses that caught the light from the Edison bulbs hanging overhead. Everything screamed effort, care, genuine interest in making this evening special. She'd cooked, she explained, gesturing toward the kitchen, where something savory was filling the air with rich aromas. Homemade pasta with a sauce her grandmother had taught her. The kind of detail that made this feel real, substantial, like the beginning of something that could matter. I complimented her space, her cooking, the playlist flowing softly from speakers I couldn't see. She accepted each compliment with practiced grace, deflecting attention back to me with questions that felt genuinely curious rather than perfunctory. What did I think of a neighborhood? Had I always wanted to work in architecture? Did I prefer red or white wine? Her attention felt intoxicating after months of shallow dating app conversations that never progressed beyond surface pleasantries. This was different. She was different. Or so I believed. But that click, that tiny, insignificant sound of the lock, engaging. It should have made me pause. Should have made me ask why she locked it so deliberately, so immediately after I entered. Instead, I followed her deeper into the apartment, accepting the wine glass she offered, settling onto her couch while she finished preparing our meal. My phone was in my jacket pocket hanging by the door that was now locked. The door I hadn't watched her unlock before securing it behind me. These details floated through my consciousness without landing, dismissed as paranoia or social awkwardness rather than the warnings they actually were. She brought out plates piled with pasta, sat across from me at the small table, and we began to eat. The conversation flowed easily between bites, lubricated by wine that was better than anything I usually bought for myself. She asked about my family, my childhood, my dreams beyond my current job. I found myself opening up, sharing things I normally kept guarded during early dates. She listened with an intensity that felt flattering, her eyes never leaving my face, her questions probing deeper with each answer I gave. It felt like connection, like intimacy building naturally between two people discovering compatibility. It never occurred to me that she was gathering information, that every detail I shared was being cataloged, assessed, stored away for purposes I couldn't yet imagine. The wine was excellent, and I said so. She smiled, pleased, and refilled my glass before I'd quite finished what was there. The bottle was already half empty, though I couldn't remember drinking that much. My tolerance was decent, but I was starting to feel the pleasant warmth that came with good wine and better company. Everything felt soft around the edges, comfortable, safe. She asked if I told anyone where I was tonight. The question felt casual, wrapped in concern about whether I needed to check in with someone, whether I had obligations I was neglecting to spend time with her. I shook my head, explained that my roommate was out of town, that my friends knew I had a date, but not the specifics. Why would they need to know? This was private, personal, the early stages of something that might become important, but wasn't ready to be scrutinized yet. She nodded, satisfied, and the conversation moved on. We talked about travel, about places we'd been, and places we wanted to go. She described a trip to Iceland with such vivid detail, I could almost see the northern lights she'd witnessed, feel the volcanic sand beneath her feet. I shared my own travel stories, lesser adventures to local cities and national parks that felt mundane compared to her experiences. She insisted they were fascinating, leaned forward as I talked, made me feel like the most interesting person she'd ever met. The validation was addictive. Somewhere during the second course, a salad with ingredients I couldn't quite identify, but that tasted incredible. My head started feeling heavier. Not drunk exactly, but disconnected. My words came slower, my thoughts taking longer to form. I mentioned feeling tired, apologized for being poor company. She waved it off, said the wine was stronger than most people expected, that I should relax, that there was no pressure. She suggested we move to the couch, put on a movie, let me rest a bit before I drove home. It sounded reasonable, considerate even. I stood from the table, and the room tilted slightly. She steadied me with a hand on my elbow, guided me to the couch, helped me sit. The cushions were incredibly soft, or maybe I was incredibly tired. My limbs felt heavy, my eyelids wanting to close. She sat beside me, closer than she'd been all evening, and I felt her hand on my shoulder. Comforting at first, then something else. Her fingers gripped tighter than necessary. I tried to focus on her face, to read her expression, but my vision was blurring at the edges. Something was wrong. The realization came slowly, fighting through the fog in my brain. The wine, the food, the questions about who knew where I was. Everything that had felt like care and connection suddenly reframed itself as calculation and control. I tried to stand, to say I needed to leave, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My legs were useless, my arms barely responding to commands from my brain. Panic cut through the drowsiness, sharp and cold. I managed to form words, to ask what was happening, what she'd done. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood, walked calmly to the door, that locked door, and checked the deadbolt. Then she turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen during our weeks of messaging. Cold, empty, nothing like the warmth she'd projected all evening. She returned to where I was slumped helplessly on her couch and sat in the chair across from me, crossing her legs with casual elegance. Then she began to talk, and nothing she said matched the person I thought I'd been getting to know. She explained that she'd been doing this for 18 months, perfecting her approach with each new person. The dating profile was engineered, every photo chosen for specific psychological impact, every interest listed to appeal to the widest range of targets. The conversations were scripted, variations on patterns she'd found most effective at building trust quickly. Even her apartment was staged, furnished specifically to project success and stability and culture. None of it was real. It was all theater designed to get people exactly where I was now, drugged, trapped, and completely at her mercy. I tried to process what she was saying, but my thoughts kept slipping away like water through cupped hands. She drugged me. The wine, probably, though maybe the food too. Something strong enough to paralyze me without rendering me unconscious. She wanted me aware, she explained. Wanted me to understand what was happening, to experience the full weight of my mistake. Because that's what this was, she said. A mistake. My mistake for being too trusting, too eager for connection, too willing to overlook small inconsistencies because I wanted to believe someone like her could be interested in someone like me. She stood and walked to a closet I hadn't noticed before, built seamlessly into the exposed brick wall. When she opened it, I saw supplies that made my blood run cold despite my body's inability to respond. Rope, plastic sheeting, A duffel bag packed with items I couldn't identify but knew instinctively were dangerous. She selected a few things, brought them to the coffee table, arranged them with the same care she'd used setting the dinner table. Each movement was deliberate, unhurried. She had all the time in the world because no one knew where I was. No one would come looking until I failed to show up for work Monday morning, and even then, they'd assume I was sick or dealing with a personal emergency. By the time anyone actually worried, it would be too late. I managed to make a sound, something between a plea and a question. She looked at me with what might have been pity if her eyes had held any warmth at all. She told me not to fight the drugs, that resistance only made things harder. She'd learned that from previous attempts, she said. Previous attempts. The words confirmed what I'd already begun to understand. I wasn't the first. Wouldn't be the last. Just another person who'd mistaken predatory calculation for genuine interest, who'd walked willingly into a trap because the bait had been perfectly calibrated to my specific vulnerabilities. My vision started to darken around the edges. I fought against it, terrified that losing consciousness meant losing any chance of survival. But fighting required energy my body didn't have. The last thing I saw clearly was her standing over me, checking her watch, making some mental calculation about timing. Then everything went black, and I was alone with the drugs and the darkness, and the certainty that I'd made a catastrophic mistake. I woke to pain. My shoulders screamed from being pulled behind me, an unnatural angle, my wrists bound so tightly I couldn't feel my hands. I was no longer on the couch, but on the floor, cold hardwood pressing against my cheek. My ankles were bound too, and when I tried to move, I discovered I'd been hogtied, wrists and ankles connected behind me, so that any struggle only tightened the restraints. Panic flooded my system, burning away the last of the drug-induced fog. I was fully awake now, fully aware, and that awareness was its own kind of torture. She was sitting nearby, visible in my limited field of vision, doing something on her laptop. The mundane normalcy of it was somehow worse than if she'd been standing over me with a weapon. She was checking emails or browsing social media or shopping online while I lay bound on her floor. When she noticed I was conscious, she closed the laptop and gave me her full attention. Her expression was clinical, assessing, like a scientist observing a specimen's reaction to stimuli. She asked if I was comfortable, which would have been funny if it wasn't so horrifying. Then she explained what happened next. She had questions, she said, about my life, my routines, my finances, about passwords and account access, and where I kept valuable items. She needed information, and I was going to provide it. The alternative, she explained with chilling casualness, was that things would become significantly more unpleasant. She didn't elaborate on what unpleasant meant, but the supplies she'd laid out earlier provided enough context. I had a choice: cooperate and potentially survive this, or resist and guarantee that survival became impossible. The choice felt like no choice at all. I gave her what she wanted. My voice came out hoarse, unfamiliar, but the words were clear enough. Bank account passwords, the PIN for my phone, the location of my laptop, and what security measures protected it. Every detail of my digital life spilled out in response to her methodical questions. She typed as I talked, presumably verifying information in real time, confirming I wasn't lying or misdirecting. When she was satisfied, she transferred money from my accounts to ones I didn't recognize. Not everything. She was smart enough to know that emptying accounts completely would trigger immediate fraud alerts, but enough to hurt. Enough that recovering financially would take years. She explained, unprompted, that this was about survival. Not mine, hers. The apartment, the lifestyle, the perfectly curated persona, all cost money she didn't have through legitimate means. So she developed this system, this method of extracting value from people too trusting or too desperate for connection to properly vet the person on the other side of the screen. She'd done it 17 times before me. 18 counting tonight. Some had fought more than others. Some had cooperated quickly like I had. The outcomes varied, she said, depending on factors she was still learning to predict. Her tone suggested this was fascinating to her, a puzzle she was solving through trial and error. I was just another data point. Time lost meaning while I lay on that floor. My body alternated between numbness and sharp pain as circulation was cut off and partially restored by slight shifts in position. She moved about the apartment, conducting her evening routine as if I wasn't there, changing into comfortable clothes, making tea, watching something on her laptop that made her laugh occasionally. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. She drugged me, robbed me, bound me, threatened me, and now she was laughing at a video like everything was normal. Like I was furniture rather than a human being experiencing trauma that would mark the rest of my life. Eventually, she returned her attention to me. She explained that she'd keep me here for 24 hours, long enough to drain what she could from my accounts, use my credentials to access anything valuable, and ensure I was sufficiently traumatized to think twice before reporting what happened. People who were too scared rarely went to police, she'd learned. The ones who were released after lengthy captivity were so grateful to be alive they convinced themselves cooperation was the smart choice. They rationalized their silence as self-preservation rather than cowardice. Most never reported her. The few who did found their stories difficult to prove. No physical injuries, money transferred through their own accounts with their own passwords, evidence suggesting they'd gone willingly to her apartment. Cops saw messy dating situations gone wrong rather than clear-cut crimes. She asked if I understood. I nodded as much as the restraints allowed. She seemed pleased, said cooperation suited me, that I was smarter than some of the others who tried fighting and made everything harder on themselves. The compliment made me nauseous. I didn't want to be good at this, didn't want to be the kind of victim she found easy to manage. But survival required swallowing pride and rage, and playing whatever role kept me alive until this nightmare ended. Hours passed. She ordered food delivery, ate it at her dining table, while I remained bound on the floor, occasionally offering me water through straw, like that was kindness rather than the bare minimum to keep me functional. She talked sometimes, telling me about her life, her childhood, the series of betrayals and disappointments that had led her to this method of survival. I didn't ask for her backstory, didn't want to humanize her or understand her, or do anything that might create sympathy for someone who'd turned me into a victim. But she talked anyway, seeming to need an audience, someone to hear her justifications even if they'd never absolve her. Night turned to morning based on light changes around the window coverings. I'd spent entire night on that floor, drifting between awareness and something like sleep that was really just my brain shutting down to protect itself from overwhelming stress. My body hurt everywhere. My wrists were raw from the restraints. My shoulders felt dislocated. Thirst made my throat ache. I'd lost all dignity hours ago, forced to ask permission for basic needs, forced to accept help with things I hadn't needed help with since childhood. She'd stripped me of everything: money, autonomy, dignity, security, and we both knew the stripping was complete. Morning brought a shift in her energy. She became more businesslike, checking items off some mental list. She used my phone to text my roommate with an excuse about staying at a friend's place, explaining I'd be home tomorrow. The message sounded like me because she'd studied my texting patterns during our weeks of conversation, learned my vocabulary and emoji usage, and the casual tone I used with friends. My roommate responded with a thumbs up, completely unaware that someone else was manipulating my digital presence. She showed me the exchange, not cruelly but matter-of-factly, demonstrating how thoroughly she'd assumed control of my life. She explained that she'd release me tonight, after sunset, when fewer people were around to witness a disoriented person leaving her building. She'd return my clothes, my phone, my wallet minus the cash. She'd call me a rideshare to take me home. She'd even provide a cover story if I needed one: food poisoning, too much to drink, a migraine that knocked me out for a day. People would believe it because people wanted to believe in simple explanations rather than complicated truths. And I would go along with it, she predicted, because the alternative was admitting what happened, inviting scrutiny and questions and the knowledge that I'd been so thoroughly fooled. She wasn't wrong. Even as I lay there hating her and myself in equal measure, I was already constructing the lies I'd tell. Already imagining how I'd explain the missing money as my own poor financial decisions rather than theft. Already planning to delete the dating app, block her profile, and pretend this entire evening had never happened. The shame was overwhelming, acidic, eating away at any thoughts of justice or revenge. I just wanted it over. Wanted to go home and shower for hours and try to scrub away the feeling of violation that I knew would linger long after the physical evidence faded. But something changed. A sound from outside the apartment, voices in the hallway, loud and getting louder. Then pounding on the door, aggressive and official. Police, announcing their presence, demanding the door be opened. Her face transformed from confident control to pure panic in an instant. She stood frozen, looking between me and the door, calculating whether she could hide evidence, whether she could talk her way out, whether there was any scenario where this ended without her arrest. The pounding continued, more insistent, accompanied by threats to break down the door if she didn't open it immediately. She looked at me one last time, and I saw something I hadn't seen before: fear. Real, genuine fear that she'd finally been caught, that her system had failed, that consequences were unavoidable. She moved toward the bedroom, perhaps planning to hide or destroy evidence or escape through a window. But she didn't make it. The door burst open with a crash of splintering wood, and suddenly the apartment was full of officers in uniform, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands. She raised her hands immediately, dropping to her knees without resistance, her expression shifting to something resigned and almost relieved. Like some part of her had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was inevitable. Officers surrounded her, cuffing her quickly, while others moved through the apartment, clearing rooms and ensuring there were no additional threats. One of them found me on the floor and immediately called for medical assistance, kneeling beside me to check my condition. Her voice was gentle, professional, asking questions I could barely process through the shock of sudden rescue. Was I injured? Had I been assaulted? How long had I been restrained? I answered automatically, words tumbling out in a confused rush, trying to explain what happened, how I'd gotten here, what she'd done. Paramedics arrived and carefully cut my restraints, and the rush of blood back into my hands and feet was excruciating. They checked my vitals, assessed me for serious injuries, asked about the drugs I'd been given. I told them about the wine, the food, the hours of paralysis followed by this extended captivity. They nodded with grim familiarity, like they'd seen this before, like I wasn't the first person they'd found in this exact situation. One of them started in 4 while another took photos of the marks on my wrists and ankles, documenting evidence of what had been done to me. Detectives took over once the paramedics stabilized me, asking for my statement while everything was still fresh. I told them everything: the dating app, the weeks of conversation, the dinner invitation, the locked door, the drugging, the robbery, the restraints, all of it. They listened with careful attention, taking detailed notes, asking clarifying questions that helped me organize the chaos in my mind into a coherent narrative. They told me I wasn't her first victim, that they'd been investigating her for months after multiple reports from other cities. She'd been moving frequently, changing profiles, evolving her methods. But one of her previous victims had been more persistent than most, had hired a private investigator who'd tracked her here, who'd alerted police to her presence. They'd been building a case when my roommate had called in a welfare check. My roommate. I'd apparently sent him a text earlier that struck him as wrong. The phrasing was slightly off, the emoji usage not quite right. He'd tried calling, and when I didn't answer, concern turned to worry. He'd remember me mentioning a date, had gone through my phone's dating app history before I left and screenshotted the profile just in case. When I didn't come home and didn't respond to calls, he'd contacted police with the screenshot and his concerns. They'd already had her address from the prior investigation. Everything had aligned: timing, information, concern from someone who knew me well enough to recognize when something was wrong. I'd been saved by details and intuition and luck. She was being processed, charged with multiple counts across multiple jurisdictions. The detectives explained that my case was just the most recent in a pattern spanning years. She'd refined her system through practice, gotten better at selecting victims who'd be unlikely to report, better at covering her tracks. But patterns eventually revealed themselves. Evidence accumulated, and now it was over. They transported me to the hospital despite my protests that I was fine. I wasn't fine. The examination revealed dehydration, minor nerve damage in my wrists from restraints, elevated stress hormones, and psychological trauma that would require professional treatment. They kept me overnight for observation, monitoring my recovery from the drugs, ensuring no lasting physical damage. My roommate arrived within an hour, pale and shaken, apologizing repeatedly for not acting sooner, for not trusting his instincts immediately. I told him he'd saved my life, that his attention to detail and willingness to seem paranoid had been the only thing standing between me and whatever would have happened when she'd finished with me. The police recovered most of the stolen money, though not all. Some had already been moved to accounts they couldn't trace, dissolved into the digital ether. My bank worked with me on the losses, fraud protections covering some but not everything. The financial damage was significant but survivable. The psychological damage was harder to quantify. I couldn't sleep without seeing her face, couldn't think about dating without feeling sick, couldn't trust my own judgment about people anymore. Every interaction felt potentially dangerous. Every smile felt potentially fake. Every invitation felt like a trap. Therapy helped slowly. My therapist specialized in trauma from interpersonal violence, understood the specific kind of violation that came from someone weaponizing trust and connection. We worked through my guilt, the irrational but persistent belief that I should have known, should have been smarter, should have protected myself better. She helped me understand that predators like her succeeded specifically because they were skilled at manipulation, that my response was normal human behavior, not stupidity or weakness. Intelligence didn't protect against social engineering when the engineering was sufficiently sophisticated. The trial was months later, and I had to testify about what happened. Sitting in that courtroom, recounting the details of my victimization in front of strangers, was re-traumatizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Her defense tried to characterize it as a date gone wrong, consensual activities I'd regretted afterward. But the physical evidence, my injuries, the drugs in my system, the stolen money, combined with testimony from her other victims, painted an undeniable picture. She was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, robbery, and assault. The judge sentenced her to 25 years, calling her crimes calculated predation on vulnerable people seeking connection. I felt nothing watching her being led away. Not satisfaction, not relief, not closure. Just emptiness where fear and rage and shame had been living for months. Justice didn't undo what happened. It didn't restore my sense of safety or my ability to trust. It just meant she couldn't do it to anyone else for a while. That mattered, I supposed, but it didn't heal me. Recovery was slow and nonlinear. Some days I felt almost normal, capable of functioning and moving forward. Other days I couldn't leave my apartment, couldn't handle the stress of being around people, couldn't shake the feeling that danger was everywhere waiting for me to let my guard down again. My roommate was patient, understanding, giving me space when I needed it and company when isolation became too heavy. Friends try to help, but most didn't understand the specific kind of trauma that came from this type of violation. They wanted me to move on and not let her win and get back out there. They meant well, but didn't grasp that healing wasn't a choice, wasn't something I could accelerate through positive thinking or determination. The dating apps stayed deleted. The thought of swiping through profiles, initiating conversations, trying to determine who was genuine and who was performing made me physically ill. I knew statistically that most people on dating apps were real people seeking real connections. But knowing something intellectually didn't change how it felt emotionally. The risk felt insurmountable. My therapist said that might change with time, or it might not. Some trauma permanently altered risk assessment, and that was okay. There were other ways to meet people, other paths to connection that didn't require trusting strangers in private spaces. Work was difficult. My concentration suffered, my productivity dropped, and explaining why, without revealing what happened, felt impossible. I eventually told my supervisor a simplified version, that I'd been the victim of a crime, that I was dealing with PTSD, that I needed some accommodations while I recovered. They were understanding, arranged for flexible hours, and the option to work from home when needed. The consideration helped. Being able to control my environment, to feel safe while I worked, made functioning possible even on difficult days. Support groups help more than individual therapy sometimes. Sitting in a room with other people who understood exactly what violation felt like, who didn't need explanations or justifications, who accepted that recovery was messy and ongoing, provided a kind of relief I hadn't known I needed. We shared strategies for managing triggers, for reclaiming autonomy, for slowly rebuilding trust in ourselves and others. We celebrated small victories, sleeping through the night, going to a social event, making a week without a panic attack. We supported each other through setbacks without judgment. Community, it turned out, was part of healing. Slowly, over months and then years, life became manageable again. The hypervigilance faded to a manageable level of caution. The nightmares decreased in frequency. I learned to sit with discomfort rather than being consumed by it. I started accepting invitations again, carefully, with safety measures in place. I told people where I was going, checked in regularly, met in public spaces until trust was established. These precautions felt reasonable rather than paranoid now. They were lessons learned through the worst possible education, but they were lessons nonetheless. I should have known when she locked the door behind me, but I didn't. And for a long time, I blamed myself for that, for missing the warning sign that seemed so obvious in retrospect, for being trusting when I should have been suspicious, for wanting connection badly enough to overlook inconsistencies. But blame, I eventually learned, was just another way of hurting myself. She was responsible for what she did, not me for failing to prevent it. What I learned from that night, from the drugging and binding and violation and terror, is that predators exist, and they're often skilled at appearing like exactly what we're looking for. They study their targets, engineer their approaches, exploit normal human needs for connection and belonging. Being victimized by someone like that doesn't make you stupid or naive or weak. It makes you human. It means you still had capacity for trust that hadn't been destroyed by cynicism or previous trauma. There's no shame in that, even though it took me years to believe it. The warning signs are always there, people say. Trust your instincts. But instincts are complicated when loneliness is loud and connection is rare. When someone seems to understand you in ways others don't. When the alternative to taking a risk is staying safe, but staying alone. Sometimes the warning signs are clear only after danger has passed, visible in the rearview mirror, but invisible through the windshield. And sometimes we make the best choices we can with the information we have, and those choices lead to harm anyway. If there's anything I want people to take from my story, it's this. If something happens to you, if you find yourself trapped or violated or traumatized by someone you trusted, it's not your fault. You don't have to have been perfect to deserve safety. You don't have to have seen every warning sign to be worth protecting. And recovery is possible, even when it feels impossible. It's slow, and it's hard, and it's not linear, but it's possible. I survived that night. I survived the investigation and the trial and the years of recovery that followed. I'm still surviving, still learning to live in a world that sometimes feels dangerous, but that also contains kindness and beauty and genuine connection. The fear doesn't own me anymore. She doesn't own me anymore. I own my story now, and I'm choosing to share it not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to resilience. Subscribe to hear more stories about survival and recovery. Like this if you believe healing is possible even after the worst happens. And watch the next video, because sometimes the warnings we should have known become the wisdom we carry forward. Sometimes the worst nights of our lives become the foundation for stronger, more authentic versions of ourselves. Sometimes we don't see the danger until it's too late, but surviving it means we're still here, still fighting, still growing. And that matters more than the mistakes we made along the way.